In 2026 something will begin. I know because I saw it. Because I died and came back to tell the tale. Guys, I need you to stay with me until the end, because what I'm about to say is the most important thing I've ever said in my life. It's not an exaggeration. It's not an act I really died. My heart stopped. The doctors have the record, the time, everything documented. And I'm only here in front of this camera now because something happened there that I can't keep to myself. I tried to stay quiet these past few days. I tried to process it alone. But every time I close my eyes, I see it all again with the same clarity as when it happened. And then I understood that it's not meant to be kept to myself. It's meant to be told. It was a car accident. On a road I know, one I've driven hundreds of times in my life. The car ended up in the river that runs alongside that road, and the water rushed in quickly, too quickly. I tried to get out, tried to open the door, tried to break the window, tried everything my head tells me to do in that moment of utter despair. But the current was strong, and the water kept coming in, and there came a point where I couldn't fight anymore. I remember the cold. I'll never forget that cold. It wasn't just the cold of the water. It was an inner cold. As if my body knew before my mind that this was the end. And then I stopped fighting. Not because I wanted to, because I had nothing left to do. And that's when the strangest and at the same time most real thing I've ever experienced in my entire life happened. I left my body, I know. Believe me, I know how it sounds. But I was up there looking down, seeing my own body inside that car underwater, and I felt no pain, no fear, nothing that makes sense to feel at that moment. What I felt was an absurd clarity. As if my whole life had been noise and suddenly it became silence. A silence that had weight, that had presence, that had its own temperature. Then I wasn't looking at the river anymore. I was somewhere else. And this place is impossible to describe properly because there isn't a human vocabulary sufficient for it. It wasn't the sky from church paintings. It wasn't darkness. It was a living presence. A light that didn't come from any specific point. It was the very substance of the place. And someone was there. And people, I knew who it was before any words. I knew the second I saw them. Just like you know when you're looking at the sun that it's the sun without needing anyone to explain it to you. I didn't need an introduction. My whole body recognized it before my mind. He said my Name. And the way he said it, I'd never heard my own name said that way in my life. As if it were the first time someone truly knew who I really am, not who I appear to be, not who people think I am. Who I really am. And then he said something simple, direct, without any beating around the bush. He said, "You need to see something." Not for you. For them. And before I could ask who they were, before I could say anything, everything around me changed. And what he began to show me is the reason I'm here in front of this camera today. Because what I saw isn't something you can carry alone. It's not something you can pretend didn't happen and go back to normal life. I tried. These past few days after the hospital, I've been silent, trying to find an explanation that made sense within what I thought was possible. I didn't find one. Because what happened to me doesn't fit into a normal explanation. It only fits into the truth. And the truth is that Jesus Christ asked me to come back. He asked me to open my eyes, he asked me to breathe again, and he asked me to tell what I saw. To everyone who has ears to hear. Because what's coming, what he showed me, is greater than anything we can imagine. And time is shorter than we think. Then he took me to a hospital. Not a modern hospital. No. It was the future. I knew that without having to ask, just as I knew who he was without needing an introduction. And what I saw in that place left me speechless. The corridors were packed in a way that made no sense. Stretchers in the hallways, people on the floor, people on the stairs, people everywhere. There was physical space to put a human body. The lighting had that greenish, flickering fluorescent hue, and I could really smell it. It was disinfectant mixed with something the disinfectant couldn't quite mask. I stood there staring at it, trying to process the sheer scale of what was in front of me. A nurse rushed past us. Her mask was soaked. She didn't see us. None of them saw us. We were ghosts in their future, witnesses to something that hadn't yet happened, but already seemed inevitable. And Jesus spoke in that calm voice that didn't match the chaos around us. He said, "This starts small. A cluster of cases in Southeast Asia. The news will call it a new strain of flu." They'll be wrong. I looked at a young doctor, probably about 30, sliding down the wall until he sat on the floor with his head in his hands. He looked like he'd aged 20 years in a single shift. And Jesus said, "This isn't like what happened before. It moves faster, it kills differently. And the response will be worse than the disease itself." Then I said, "Why are you showing me this?" "Why me?" And he turned to me and said something that will stay with me forever. He said, "Because the problem isn't the virus. The problem is fear." And I needed someone simple to see this before it happened. Someone who wouldn't complicate things. Someone who would get straight to the point. I kept thinking about everyone I love, family, friends, people I want to protect. And the vision continued. He didn't let me stop to process it. There was more to see. We passed through walls like smoke and were on a street. It could have been any city. Closed shops, broken windows, a line of people on the sidewalk waiting for something, food or medicine. It was impossible to tell. And what broke me wasn't the line. It was the faces of the people in line. I've seen despair before. Everyone has. But this was different. It was a despair that had already passed the stage of screaming and was in the stage of simply existing. As if these people had forgotten that there was another way to feel. A military vehicle passed by on the street with loudspeakers on the roof broadcasting instructions. The people in line didn't raise their heads. They had already heard everything before. And that's when he said the thing that changed everything inside me. He said, "The virus is just the beginning. Look what happens when people get scared enough." And I looked at that street, at those people, at that vehicle, and I understood what he was saying. It wasn't about illness. It was never about illness. It was about what people accept when they are terrified enough. It was about the choices that seem reasonable when fear takes the place of thought, and I was on my knees inside, not from weakness, from heaviness, from the weight of understanding what I was seeing. And then he told me, "There's more." And the vision changed again. And what came next was the hardest part of everything I saw. The part that made me sit on the bathroom floor of the hospital that night after I was discharged and cry for 2 hours straight. Because what he showed me next wasn't just about the future of the world. It was about a choice. A choice that every person listening to this will have to make. And that choice can't be undone once it's made. He took me inside a building. It looked like a government building. I don't know why I knew, but I did. There's an energy in those places that you recognize even if you've never been inside one. A long table, serious people sitting around it, documents in front of each one, screens with numbers and maps and graphs. And the most disturbing thing of all was that nobody was panicking. Nobody was screaming. All that chaos I had seen in the hospital, all that pain I had seen in the street, had reached that room transformed into a spreadsheet. Transformed into a strategy. I kept looking at these people trying to see if they were bad people. And they weren't. And that was the scariest thing of all. Jesus stood beside me, looking at that table, and said, "They're going to implement the response in stages. The first stage seems completely reasonable. Mandatory testing. Screening at airports, at borders, in public buildings." And he looked at me and said, "People will accept it without questioning because they've accepted it before." I thought, okay, I would accept it too. And he said, exactly. That's why it starts there, not because testing is the problem, but because it builds the habit. It builds the idea that your body needs permission to circulate. And once that idea is in place, the next stage becomes much easier to sell. Each step seems reasonable on its own. It's only when you put all the steps together that the destination becomes clear. Then the vision advanced to the second stage, tracking. Contact tracing, that's what they were going to call it, digital monitoring of movements and interactions. And Jesus said, this is where the infrastructure is built. People will accept it because it looks like a public health tool. It seems temporary. It seems necessary. But the infrastructure built to track a virus is the same infrastructure that tracks everything else. And it doesn't disappear when the virus disappears. It stays. It grows. It finds new uses. I saw this happening in the vision. I saw the technology being gradually normalized. Mandatory check-in everywhere. Temperature checks at the entrance of any establishment. Circles marked on the floor where people should stand. And each of these things alone seemed small. But together they formed a pattern. It was a cage being built door by door, while the people inside still thought they were outside. Then the vision jumped to winter. And I saw the third stage, and that was the one that broke me inside. Because it was different from everything I had seen, it wasn't restriction. It was an offer, a solution, a clean, organized clinic, people entering in an orderly line, leaving with a relieved smile on their faces. And Jesus said, when the virus has passed through enough of the population, when everyone knows someone who has died, when fear has reached its peak, that's when they present the answer. A chip, small, almost invisible, implanting takes seconds, and they will call it an advance. They will call it a solution. They will say it monitors your health in real time, confirms your status, gives you access to everything that was taken away during the crisis. Work, commerce, travel, normal life, everything returns. Just accept a simple procedure. I watched the people leaving the clinic and saw the relief on their faces. The relief of those who had finally found a way out, and I felt my stomach churn. Because Jesus looked at me at that moment and said, the chip isn't just a health device. Once implanted, it does more than monitor. IT nephews. It alters something fundamental in how a person connects with the spiritual. Those people leaving with relief on their faces didn't know what they had just lost. You couldn't see it from the outside, but you could see it in their eyes, an absence. As if a light had been turned off without them realizing it was on. And he said, it's not the mark that condemns. It's the conscious choice to accept what it represents. And I thought of Revelation. I thought of the passages I had heard my whole life, without truly understanding, and for the first time, I understood. Not as a theological concept, as something real happening in front of me. And then he showed me something I still can't get out of my head to this day. I saw people, thousands of them, with an emptiness in their eyes that had nothing to do with physical illness. They moved, spoke, worked, bought, sold. Everything functioning. Everything normal on the outside. But something essential was missing. It was like watching puppets perform perfect movements without anyone having explained to them what the movements meant. And Jesus said, this is what acceptance costs. Not just freedom of movement. Not just autonomy over one's own body. The ability to hear my voice, to feel conviction. To choose redemption, the chip doesn't just track location. It serves the connection. And that's the part nobody reads when signing the consent form. Then he took me away from that place. From those people with empty eyes. And I went along without resisting, because at that point I had already understood that resisting made no sense. Every plate he tuf mif IT hurt. No, even if I didn't want to. And the next place that appeared in my vision was different from everything I had seen until then. It wasn't chaos. It wasn't a hospital. It wasn't a government office. It was an ordinary street, an ordinary city. And what was happening on that street was so normal, so everyday, that it took me a few seconds to understand why he was showing me that. There was a person trying to enter a supermarket, bag in hand, shopping list, the face of someone who just wants to get through the day and go home. And they couldn't get in, not because the door was locked, because the terminal at the entrance read something on their wrist and made a sound. A low, almost discreet sound. And the security guard shook his head. And that person stood outside holding the empty bag, not quite understanding what to do next. And Jesus said, "See what happens to those who refuse." And I kept looking at that scene and something inside me broke. I wasn't being dragged. I wasn't being arrested. There was no one screaming. It was worse than that. Akaitivas seilik aitivas normal. It was just a person being excluded in such an integrated way into the system that other. People passed by on the sidewalk without even realizing that something wrong was happening. And he said, that's how it works. Not with violence at the beginning. With inconvenience. With gradual impossibility. First you can't get into the supermarket. Then you can't access the bank. Then you can't pay rent. Then you can't exist within the system in any practical way. And the pressure keeps increasing until the choice no longer seems like a choice. It seems like the only logical way out. And that's exactly where they want to put you. I asked, and what about the people who resist anyway? What happens to them? And the perspective changed, and I saw families. Not in dramatic flight, not in cinematic confrontation. I saw families leaving cities with what fit in the car, with what fit in a backpack, with what fit in their arms. Taking back roads. Arriving in remote places that most people don't even know exist, and these people didn't look defeated. They looked like they had made a difficult decision and were at peace with it. They looked like they had lost a lot and discovered that what remained was what had always truly mattered. And I felt something I didn't expect to feel at that moment. In the midst of all that, in the midst of the heaviest visions I've ever had in my life, I felt hope. Real hope. The kind that doesn't depend on circumstances to exist. And Jesus said, there are places, specific places where my protection will be stronger, where communities can sustain themselves outside the system, where those who refuse the mark will be able to truly live and not just survive. 5 places. 5 countries. Not by chance or convenience. Chosen for the spiritual history they carry, for the resources they have, and for the protection that already exists over them. And before I could ask which ones they were, he was already showing me the first. And the first one surprised me. Because it wasn't the most obvious place. It was the most unlikely place. And that's exactly what made me understand that this vision wasn't coming from my own head. The first place was the United States. But not the cities. Not the urban centers I had seen in previous visions, full of lines and despair and military vehicles with loudspeakers. The interior regions. The deep rural areas that most people fly over without looking down. Lands that still know how to produce food without depending on an industrial supply chain. Communities that still remember how to live without needing digital permission to exist. And Jesus said, the United States has something that few countries have. They have a tradition of resistance that is in the nation's DNA. There are people there who have been prepared for years without knowing exactly what they were preparing for. And when the system tightens, these people will understand once and for all the purpose of everything they have built. And I saw those rural communities receiving families arriving from the cities, making space, sharing what they had. And there was dignity in that reception that made me swallow hard. Then France appeared, and I almost asked if you were sure. Because the France I knew was Europe, it was the system, it was strong government. It was everything that seemed the opposite of refuge. And he said, "It's not the France of postcards. It's the France of the interior, the deep interior, the rural regions that Paris forgot exist. Ancient communities with roots of faith that survived wars, occupations, centuries of persecution. There is a spiritual heritage buried in that soil that will be activated when the pressure comes." And I saw in the vision small villages. Old stone, churches with centuries of prayer ingrained in the walls. People who had learned to distrust centralized power because their family history was one of survival despite centralized power. And Jesus said, "The faith that withstood the guillotine will withstand the chip." And that stayed with me in a way I can't quite explain. And the vision continued to move. After the United States and France, he showed me the third place. And this time I recognized it before he spoke. Because there was something in those landscapes that felt familiar, even though I had never been there. It was Mexico, but not the Mexico of the news. Not the Mexico of big cities and drug trafficking and everything that people think of first when they hear that name. It was the deep Mexico. The Mexico of the indigenous communities in the mountains of Oaxaca and Chiapas. The Mexico of the peoples who were never completely absorbed by the modern system because they always maintained their own forms of organization, their own local economies, their own forms of spirituality that were now being transformed by faith in Christ. And Jesus said, "These peoples know things that the modern world has forgotten. They know how to cultivate without oil. They know how to preserve without electricity. They know how to build community without algorithms. And when the global system breaks down, their knowledge will be worth more than anything universities have taught in recent decades." And I saw in the vision families arriving in those mountainous communities of Mexico, not as tourists, as people who came to learn, who came to contribute, who came to be a part of it. And there was an exchange happening in those scenes that moved me in a way I didn't expect. Ancient knowledge being passed on, faith being shared, different communities discovering they had more in common than borders and languages suggested. And Jesus said, Mexico will surprise the world. Because the world looks at Mexico and sees what is broken. But I look at Mexico and see what is being prepared. And that difference in perspective is the difference between despair and hope, between seeing the end and seeing the beginning. Then Colombia appeared. And this time I didn't need to overcome any surprise because by then I had already learned that the places he chose were always those that the world had underestimated. And Colombia was exactly that. A country that had gone through decades of conflict, violence, instability, everything that should have destroyed anything of value, and yet it was still standing. It still had faith. It still had communities that knew what it meant to resist without losing their humanity in the process. And Jesus said, Colombia was prepared by suffering. It sounds cruel when said like that, but it's the truth. A people who survived what they survived will not break in the face of yet another crisis. They will know what to do. They will know how to take care of each other. They will know how to maintain faith when everything around them is trying to rip it away from within. And I saw in the vision the most remote regions of Colombia, the Andes Mountains, where communities have lived for generations far from the centers of power. The Colombian Amazon, with its immensity that no control system will be able to fully manage. And there were churches in those communities. Simple churches, without production, without performance. Just people gathered with the seriousness of those who know that faith is not optional, of those who learned this the hard way. And Jesus said, when persecution comes to Colombia, it will be one of the few places where the church already knows how to function underground, because it has functioned that way before. It has survived that way before. And this institutional memory does not disappear. It remains stored in the body of the community, waiting for the moment when it will be needed again. And then the fifth place appeared, and that's what completely broke me. Because it was Brazil. And I wasn't expecting it. Not because Brazil wasn't important, but because the vision of Brazil was different from the others, more intense, more charged, as if that specific country had a weight in the vision that the others didn't have. And Jesus said, Brazil is the heart. It's not just one of the 5 places of refuge. It's the center of something bigger, the largest Christian population in the Southern Hemisphere. A faith that is no longer imported, that already has its own roots, that already has its own face, that already has its own voice. And when tribulation comes, Brazil will be called to be more than a refuge. It will be called to be a source. And I looked at that vision of Brazil and saw the interior of the country, the Cerrado, the Amazon, the riverside communities, the inland cities that the coast ignores. And I saw something that left me speechless for a long time. I saw people from all over the world arriving in Brazil, not as immigrants seeking a better life in an economic sense, as pilgrims seeking a place where faith still breathed freely, as people who had lost everything in their countries of origin and had somehow heard that there was a place in the Southern Hemisphere where spiritual covering was still intact. And Brazil was receiving these people, not without difficulty, not without tension, but it was receiving them. And Jesus said, I have always had a specific purpose for this country, a purpose that goes beyond what any human religious movement can plan or execute. And what is coming will reveal this purpose in a way that no one will be able to ignore. And I looked at that vision of Brazil with a racing heart, because I understood that it wasn't by accident that I was seeing that. It wasn't by accident that it was being shown to me. And it wasn't by accident that I was here in front of this camera telling this story now. And after he finished showing me the 5 countries, the vision didn't stop. I thought it would stop. I thought that was the end of what he had to show me. But it wasn't, because he turned to me and said, There's one more thing you need to understand before I send you back. And the way he said it, that calm and direct way that I had already learned to recognize as a sign that what was to come was going to be heavy, made me hold my breath. And he said, Location helps, but it's not salvation. And I needed to stop for a second to process that. Because throughout everything I had seen up to that point, I had built in my head the idea that arriving in one of the 5 countries was the answer. It was the plan. It was what needed to be done. And he was telling me that I had only understood half of it. He said, I have sustained my people in enemy territory before, and then he began to show me images. Not of the future, this time, of the past. Israelites in Egypt mocked, with lamb's blood as death passed over their houses. Daniel in Babylon inning his faith was na consistigit favorable circumstances. Christians in the Roman catacombs gathering underground to worship while above. Them the empire tried to erase any trace of the name of Jesus. Believers in Soviet gulags clinging to Christ when everything else had been taken away, when there was nothing left but faith in itself. And each of these images had the same weight. The same message. The same truth that he was trying to make me understand once and for all. He said, My protection follows faith, not geography. And I understood at that moment that the 5 countries were not a list of magical places where nothing bad could happen. They were places where the spiritual covering was stronger because the faith of the communities that would form there would be stronger. The protection was not in the soil. It was in the people. It was in the willingness to resist. It was in the decision not to give in, regardless of the cost. And he said, some will survive through supernatural provision in the midst of darkness. Others will seal their testimony with blood. And both paths lead to me. Both paths have the same value before me. And I thought of all the martyrs in history, of all the people who chose to die rather than deny. And for the first time in my life I understood that choice not as abstract heroism, but as a real, concrete possibility that was being placed before an entire generation. And then he showed me something I didn't expect to see at that point in the vision. He showed me the church. Not a specific denomination. Not a style of worship or a theological tradition. The church as a body, as a living organism. And what I saw filled me with shame and hope at the same time. Shame because I saw what the church had become in many places, programs, production, competition between ministries, theological debate while people were dying of spiritual hunger outside, comfort being sold as faith, prosperity being preached as a promise, and hope because I saw what the tribulation would do to all of that. I saw the fire burning away everything superficial and leaving only what was real. And what remained after the fire was something that made me cry right there in the vision. Because what remained was simple. Aitivas people, gathered not by program or production, but by real need. By real love. By the real faith that had been tested and had survived the test. Services happening in homes, in forests, in basements, anywhere 2 or 3 people could gather without being found. No sound equipment. No screen. No live broadcast. Used voices. Used praise. Just the real weight of God's presence upon people who had nothing but Him. And Jesus said, "This is what I always wanted. Not the buildings. Not the programs. Not the cultural influence. Just this. People who love me because they chose to love me when they had other options, and continued to love me when those other options disappeared." And I thought about how many times had gone to church out of curse, out of social obligation. And I felt the weight of that in a way that I couldn't pretend I didn't feel. And he looked at me at that moment and said something that was both the heaviest warning and the most beautiful promise I've ever heard in my life. He said, "The tribulation will reveal everything. It will reveal who is who. It will reveal what is real and what is performance. It will reveal where each person truly placed their trust. And that will be painful. It will be the kind of pain you can't medicate or distract yourself from or post on social media to get support. But on the other side of that revelation will be the purest and most real thing humanity has ever experienced since the first centuries of faith. And I want you to take that back. Not just the countries, not just the timeline, not just the warnings. Takes a tool. Takes a hope. Because whoever hears what you have to say will need both. They will need to know what's coming. And they will need to know that it's worth resisting. And then he said, "Now I'm going to show you the end. And I want to be honest with you here because I think you deserve total honesty." When he said that, I was scared. After everything I had seen, after the hospital, after the streets, after the chip, after the people with empty eyes, after all that, I thought I no longer had the capacity to feel fear. But when he said he was going to show me the end, something inside me recoiled. Because end is a word that carries a weight that no other word carries, and he noticed. He always noticed everything before I verbalized it. And he said, "Don't be afraid of what you're going to see. The end is not what you're imagining." And I took a deep breath, or did the equivalent of taking a deep breath in that place where I was, and said, "I'm ready." And what he showed me wasn't destruction. It wasn't a cinematic apocalypse with cities on fire and a red sky and all that. Imagery that popular culture has attached to the words end times. It was something completely different. It was a moment. A single moment. As if all of time, all of human history from the beginning to that point was just preparation for that single moment. And that moment was this, the sky opening. Not metaphorically, literally. Like a fabric being torn by hands that had been on the other side for a long time, waiting for the right moment. And on the other side of that tear there was a light that made the light of the place where I had met. Jesus seemed like a candle next to the sun. And there was a sound. A sound that wasn't made of sound waves. It was made of something that has no name in any human language. And everyone on earth heard it at the same time. And I saw what happened to the people in the 5 countries. In the communities that had resisted. In the families that had refused the mark. In the people who had lost everything and had discovered that losing everything when you have faith is not the same as losing everything when you don't. I saw these people looking at the sky the moment it opened. And what I saw in their faces was the most beautiful thing my eyes have ever recorded in my entire life. It wasn't relief. Relief is when something bad stops. What I saw in those faces was fulfillment. It was the expression of those who had spent their whole lives feeling that there was something greater than everything the world offered, and were finally seeing that greater thing appear in its true form. It was recognition. It was arrival. It was home. And Jesus said, every sacrifice will be worth it. Everything that was left behind will make sense in that moment. Every night when it seemed that faith wasn't enough, every moment when the pressure was too great and the person resisted anyway, every small choice to continue believing when there was no visible evidence to justify that belief, all of that will be present in that moment as a weight of glory, not as a distant memory, as immediate reality, as part of the celebration. And I thought about all the people who would hear what I had to say and would think it was crazy. That they would think I had hit my head in the accident and invented an elaborate story to make sense of the trauma. And I wanted to speak to those people directly at that moment. I wanted to say, I understand. I would understand too if I hadn't gone through what I went through. And as if he knew exactly what I was thinking, because he always knew. Jesus said, the people who will doubt you are not enemies. They are people who are afraid. And fear is the natural state of those who haven't yet decided who they will trust. Don't argue with them. Don't try to convince them by force of argument. Just say what you saw. Speak with the simplicity of someone who knows what they know. And leave the rest to me. Because the seed you plant today will germinate the moment circumstances make it impossible to continue pretending that nothing is happening. And when that happens, people will remember what you said. They will remember with a clarity that will surprise even themselves. And at that moment, what you said will make all the difference between a choice made with time and a choice made in desperation. And then he said one last thing before everything started to change again, before I felt like I was being pulled back. He said, you're going to come back different. It's going to be hard to fit back into who you were before. The old clothes won't fit anymore, not because you've changed size, but because you've changed shape. And the people around you will notice. Some will come closer wanting to understand what happened. Others will distance themselves without being able to explain why. And you'll have to learn to carry the mission without letting the mission consume you, because you're human. And humans need rest. They need community. They need people who love them not for what they carry, but for who they are. Don't abandon that. The mission doesn't require you to destroy yourself to fulfill it. It requires you to remain whole enough to keep saying what needs to be said for as long as necessary. And then I came back. It wasn't gradual. It wasn't smooth. It was like being punched in the chest from the inside. Suddenly there was pain. Suddenly there was weight. Suddenly there was the smell of the hospital and the noise of equipment, and voices shouting, medical terminology I didn't understand, but which I knew from the tone meant the situation was critical. Someone said 19 minutes. Someone said seconds to pronounce death. Someone said impossible in a voice that had temporarily forgotten that impossible is a word that human beings invented to describe their limits. And not the limits of everything that exists, and I opened my eyes. And the first thing I saw was a fluorescent light on the ceiling. And I thought, it's not the same light. And that was at the same time the saddest and the funniest thing I've ever thought in my life. The doctors surrounded me, asking questions I heard but couldn't yet answer. My body was back, but it needed a few minutes to remember how to function, how to breathe at the right rhythm, how to make my heart beat in a way that wouldn't alarm the monitors, how to occupy physical space after having existed in a place where physical space meant nothing. And I lay there on that stretcher, staring at the ceiling and thinking about everything I had seen. Trying to hold on to every detail like you try to hold water in your hands, knowing it will spill but trying anyway. But it didn't spill. Every detail remained. Every image remained. Every word he said remained. As if it had been recorded at a level deeper than normal memory reaches. As if it had been engraved into the very fabric of who I am. I spent 3 days in the hospital. The doctors wanted more. They wanted to do more tests, understand how someone with my data came back after 19 minutes. They wanted an explanation that would fit in a report. I understand that. It's their job. It's their way of dealing with what they can't control, turning it into data, turning it into a protocol. But I knew I didn't have a report for that. I signed the papers and left. I had more important things to do than help someone write a scientific article about cardiac anomalies. My family was worried. The people who love me looked at me with that look of someone trying to figure out if the person who came back is the same one who left. And I wanted to tell them, it's not. But not in the way you're afraid. It's better. It's more complete. It's more real. Because that's what happens when you die and come back. It's not trauma. It's not dissociation. It's not post-cardiac arrest syndrome that manuals describe with that clinical language that takes all the life out of what's being described. It's clarity. It's the clarity of someone who has seen what lies beyond and can no longer pretend that the beyond doesn't exist. Can no longer treat faith as an optional item on the list of things that make up a well-organized life. Can no longer sit in a Sunday service thinking about the week's shopping list, because now the service has a different weight. Everything has a different weight. Every conversation, every choice, every moment, when you decide what you're going to do with the time that has been given back to you. And I've woken up every day since I left the hospital thinking, what am I going to do with this day? Not anxiously, intentionally, and that's why I turned on this camera. Not because I'm the right person to do it. Not because I have the training for it, or the platform for it, or anything that people normally need to be heard. I turned on this camera because he asked me to. Simple ASZ. And I learned that when Jesus Christ asks you to do something personally, you don't procrastinate, waiting for the perfect moment or the right equipment or enough courage. You do it. You do it with what you have, where you are, in the way you can. And what I have is this camera and this room and the most vivid memory any human being has ever carried back from a near-death experience, and that will have to be enough. And I believe it is. So let me speak directly to whoever is watching this now. If you've made it this far, if you've stayed all this time listening to what I have to say, I don't think it was by accident. I learned not to believe in accidents since that day on the river. I believe you're here because something inside you recognized something in what I said. And that recognition is important. Don't ignore it. Don't minimize it by calling it curiosity, entertainment, or interesting content to share. Sit with it. Ask where it comes from. Ask what it's trying to tell you. Because the window it showed me is real. The time it showed me is short. And the choices that are coming won't wait for you to be ready to make them. The 5 countries are real. The United States, France, Mexico, Colombia, Brazil. The communities that will form in those places are real. The protection that will cover those communities is real. But more real than any country, more real than any geographical location, more real than any preparedness plan you could put together, is the choice that lies before every person listening to this. The choice to decide now, before the pressure, before the fear, before the gradual impossibility that he showed me setting in step by step. The choice to decide who you trust when everything that seemed solid begins to move. I made my choice underwater, in an icy river, without time to think. You still have time. Use set timer. Because he told me with a clarity I will not forget as long as I live. Time is shorter than you think. And what is coming is greater than anything you imagine. But, on the other side of all this, there is a light that makes any sacrifice worthwhile. I saw that light, and I came back here just to tell you that she's real.